Okay, so we're in Hebrews chapter 5, and we're on number 11. Let's look in Genesis 14, 18 through 20. This is after, remember, Lot had been in captivity. Well, where he was living, he and his family were caught up in a battle, and they were taken as hostages. And so Moses went and got them and the rest of the hostages from these other kings that were there. And on the way back through, it says that in verse 17, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of Most High God. And he said, and he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And he gave him a tithe of all. Now, the he gave him is Abram gave Melchizedek a tithe of all that he had taken back. What was the purpose of tithing? Yeah, right. That was the practical aspect of what happened with the money. Why would Abram tithe to Melchizedek? The priest. Who's he giving the money to? Yes, because that's who this is, the king of Salem, which is interesting because he's a priest and a king, which also fits Jesus. When you tithe, you're not giving it to the priest; you're giving it to God. This is a sacrifice made to God as a thanks for the safety that he'd been through in the battles that he had won, and as paying homage to what God has given. So the old law had stipulations about tithing, but tithing was around before the old law, right? Long before, because this is several hundred years before the law of Moses came. So it could be seen as a principle that had been always in existence, and it could be more or less. I'm not saying that we're tied to that, but it's a lot more complicated than just saying, well, Moses taught the tithe, so we don't have to do it. It's a little more complicated than that because it's been around long before Moses was ever in existence. And so it's something to consider. But when he did this, the argument here is that going back to Hebrews, incidentally, we see his name mentioned a couple of times in the Bible, Melchizedek, but this is the only information we have about him, and that's part of the point that he's making here. Let's see here in chapter 5, in verse 6, he also says in another place, "You're a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." Okay, so the argument is going to be made that he was giving him. It'll be later on. He was giving him a tithe, which meant that Melchizedek was superior to Abram, and just as Jesus is superior. So there's the argument that's made there. But what do we know about Melchizedek from what we read? Who was he a priest to? To God, yeah, and the God, and we don't know where he got his priesthood. We have no idea. But the point is that he was, and we know that he was because this is what Abram was tithing to and this kind of thing. Okay, so in what ways did Jesus behave as a priest while he was on earth? So he was a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. In what way? So he's interceding with God on the behalf of the people that were there. So when they came to him, he would heal them. He would also heal them spiritually, right? He would forgive their sins. Incidentally, we see evidence that they still had to go and make sacrifices, right? Remember when the 10 lepers were healed, what did they do? What did he tell them to do? Go to the temple, right? Now there are reasons for that, but the main reason was when you go to the temple, you show yourself having been healed, and they can elevate you back to your rightful place in society where you can function again. So there's still sacrifices and things going on. They had to go through ceremonial healing and things or purification, things like that. But he is making intercession for them. And did he forgive them of sins? Sure. Did the priest forgive? In a sense, but not really, right? They did the work so that the people could be forgiven. Who are the ones who made the sacrifice? Depends on how you look at this word sacrifice, right? So the people brought the animal that was to be sacrificed, but who actually cut it all up and put it on the altar? The priests did. Why didn't the regular people do it? Sorry? Right, they weren't qualified to do it. They weren't sanctified. They weren't holy. Only the people who were made holy and made priests could actually offer this sacrifice to God. So Jesus is doing that. Ultimately, though, the ultimate sacrifice that he made was himself, right? So that's the biggest way in which he played the part, if I can put it that way, of a priest. And in fact, in verse 7 here, it says, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear. So this is his point. Sure, there are other things that he did, but this ultimately is the sacrifice that he made. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And that's, not only is he the sacrifice, he's also the one who's offering the sacrifice, which is actually pretty amazing. And it says, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could technically say that. I don't know when he went into the holy place, or the most holy place, unless you're going to say when he ripped the veil in half or something, but he was on the cross at the point. So, yeah. Yeah. Right. Right, so the sacrifice was made, and then he went up into heaven. Yeah, that's right. So he's a priest. We can look to him to be a priest. He doesn't have to be a priest in the same way that Aaron was a priest. Can't be, or Aaron's descendants, because he's not from the tribe of Levi. He's not from the lineage of Aaron. So he really couldn't be a priest or a high priest, but he became one for us. So he learned, let's see here. How can the author of Hebrews in chapter 5 and verse 7 say that Jesus was heard when he cried out to be saved from death? That's true. But it says, look here at the verse, it says, with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death and was heard because of his godly fear. Now, if I'm praying for something and I say, well, God heard my prayer, that usually means that I got what I asked for, right? How can the Hebrew writer say that Jesus was heard when he went ahead and died anyway? It's not a trick question. It's just something to think about, right? So you're saying he was heard, but the answer was no. Yeah. Paul? Well, yeah, that's true. So when he supposedly was being rejected by God, he was actually praying to God for people to be forgiven. So that's why I don't believe he was rejected. But the the point here is that he was heard. If you go to Psalm 22, he heard him. We read through that one time. That's about the crucifixion. And he says, "You have heard me. You have answered me." And he did answer him, but he had to go through the death first, right? How did he answer him? By the resurrection. So he did hear him, but he raised him up. He had to go through a lot of pain to get there, though, for sure, before he was actually given the blessing of being alive again. So I think that's one way of looking at it. I think what Linda said is valuable too. That he was being heard because of the things that he was saying. God still heard what he was saying, even though the answer was no, especially or actually maybe it wasn't no. It was just wait till you go through this, and then you'll get the answer, right? Then you'll. It's not yet. So what did Jesus learn through suffering? Obedience. It's a fascinating idea, right? So did he not understand obedience before he did this? Of course he did. So how did he learn obedience? Yeah. Right. As a human, he did not want this, but he wanted whatever his father wanted, right? And that's that's indicative of a struggle, right? I mean, that's the definition of an internal struggle. And so when Luke says that he was sweating drops as of blood, why? Well, the imagery there and the words that are used is something of a struggle, like a wrestling match kind of thing, where he is exerting physical energy in this. What kind of physical energy was he exerting? It's the stress and the sorrow. That takes a toll on the body, right? Just going through the pain and the suffering and the agonizing decision to, yes, I'm going to do this, to make that decision. So we're kind of speculating here, but why did he do it 3 times? We went to the Father and said, not your will, but mine be done. I mean, not my will, but yours be done. And then he walks away, and the apostles were sleeping, right? And then he goes back again 2 more times after that. I think it's right. I think it shows that this was a struggle that he was going through, because there was a lot. He was not only going to go through lots of misery, he knew exactly what was going to happen, and he also was recognizing that he was completely innocent of anything, and yet he's being forced to go into this. Pretty amazing. Yeah, Paul? Yeah, and that's a fascinating idea in itself, isn't it? That God, who is one in one thought and one mind, actually had a difference in there, to some degree, right, of struggle, and he's just overcoming the desire to live. Yeah. Yeah. From what I see, it seems like he did. Uh, yeah, this is kind of kind of a side note, but I think it's relevant. Kind of going along with that, how many people do you suppose Jesus might have seen being crucified in his life? I mean, the Romans just did it like crazy. And he saw exactly what was happening. He knew exactly what he was going to go through. He already knew it anyway. I don't know how much his knowledge was, but there's no way he didn't know what was about to happen to him. And, it would be a whole really easy thing to turn like into Jonah and just find myself in another country somewhere, right? But he every day he got up, and you know what? Another thing that amazes me is that he knew exactly what was going to happen, and he knew when it was going to happen, and he was working for it to make sure that it did happen, and he never worried about it. He didn't even think about it, evidently, until he decided to set his face toward Jerusalem, and he didn't fret over it, and it didn't let him getting depressed and down. Oh, I can't believe I'm about to go through all this stuff. How did he behave? He worked. He did what God wanted him to do every day, right? Yeah, Robert? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. He had to learn to control himself physically, and he'd been learning it all of his life. Um, Craving that connection with God, yeah, very likely. So there's a lot of things going on there, maybe, but it's pretty amazing when you think about this. This is a human being, yes, God, but he was human. He had to learn how to control himself, and he never had to experience sin in order to learn how to control it, right? And that's a very important idea, because I've run into people who said, "Well, you got to sin in order to know what it's like, and so you can fight against it. All you're doing is making it harder for yourself." Yeah, Linda. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. That's one of the keys to his success was the amount of time he spent with the Father in prayer. I'm convinced of that. Let's see here. So he learned that through his sufferings. Is that something that we should also learn in the suffering we face? That's pretty obvious, right? In fact, if that's the only lesson we learn, that's a very valuable lesson. And sometimes we learn the wrong lessons. But one we should learn is, okay, I'm gonna go through this, however long, whatever happens at the end. I'm going through this situation, and when I come out on the other end, I'll be better off than I was when I started. And with that determination, we can find out how. Now, it's going to take some. It's going to take some thinking. We're going to have to learn and rationality. We have to think through the situation we're in, so we can get the most out of it. Because all of us have probably, if we admit it, have gone through pain and didn't get anything out of it at all. It's maybe even gotten worse. But it's always there for us. If we look for it, we can find obedience, we can find humility, we can find all kinds of things. Learning how to control ourselves. Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 5, we talk about Jesus coming to the earth, coming as a human to obey, to become a servant, even to the point of death. Okay, so the word in chapter 5 and verse 9, having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Oh, interestingly enough, I know we know this, but it's important to notice. He says, having been perfected. In what way was Jesus perfected? And let me ask you another question without seeming blasphemous. Does that mean that he wasn't perfected until this time? Perfect sacrifice, yeah. Yeah. So, morally speaking, he never did anything wrong. But he was, in a sense, imperfect until the perfection came. I mean, how could he be perfected if he was already perfect? The completeness idea. And the ultimate obedience was his death. He couldn't be completed in that sense until he died, because that's when it's completed. So it's somebody comes and says, well, Jesus was imperfect. It says there. Well, that's completely different than saying moral imperfection. He was not morally imperfect. He just, it's another thing to think about. So when Jesus was 4, did he have to learn to speak English? Did he have to learn to speak Hebrew or whatever language, Aramaic? Yes, he had to learn. Did that mean that his vocabulary was imperfect before he learned it? Yes, it was. It's not an insult to him. That's what humans do. We learn, right? And that just blows my mind that God, a perfect God, God Almighty, the eternal God, could actually come to earth and learn things, which means it shows how much he's emptied himself. And he was born, he didn't come out of the womb speaking Hebrew and doing miracles. He learned how to do all these things, and one of the final lessons he learned was this obedience of even to the point of death, which, as I've said several times, we all talk a big game. We're all thinking if we had to give our lives for God, we will. But you don't really learn to do that until you're actually in that place, and then you learn to do it. And so you get that lesson once, and if you're blessed, you might get to have another shot at it. But anyway, that's a lesson we might learn one day. You never know. Okay, so then he goes into, let's see here. The Hebrew word in chapter 5 and verse 9 says, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. The word obey literally means to listen to or to hear. So what does this tell us about the cause of not obeying? We're not listening, right? Yeah, right. So that says a lot. It says, of course, if you're not listening, you're not going to do what you're told. But sometimes we miss what we're supposed to be doing because we have our own thoughts. When we come to this, we're trying to prove something, or we're trying to get something that we want to get out of it, instead of opening our minds and saying, okay, what is it you want me to see here? That's when we're listening to what God has to say, and then we can learn from there, right? I'm not saying that we can't come with questions, but we need to listen to what God's saying in the Word, or so we can obey it. And then chapter 5 and verse 11, how does that hearing relate to the writer, to this complaint in chapter 5 and verse 11? He says, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you've become dull of hearing. What is that saying about them if they're dull of hearing? Yeah, they're not obeying God. You kind of say that they're kind of plateaued, and there is no such thing. I don't think. I think you can plateau for a little bit, but you start losing a lot. It happens when we think. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. We're continually one step in front of the other until the end, not until we have our sins forgiven and then we're done, right? It's until the end. And this is a journey that we're on. Yeah. Hold on. Yeah. Sluggish in hearing and sluggish in chapter 6 and verse 12 is the same. Yeah, and it actually is talking about being late. That's where the word comes from. It's someone who's always late. And that's the idea of it's not the matter of whether you're late or not. It's that you're just behind, right? You're sluggish. Right. Okay, so then it goes into 12 through 14, the need for spiritual understanding. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are full age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Okay, there's a lot going on here. I want to address something before we go on here. Well, let's look at number 16. What does verse 12 imply about one purpose of spiritual knowledge and growth in that? We need to always be growing. Yeah, that's true. Look at what it says here. You need someone to teach you again the first principles, and you have come to need, right? So this is showing a regression, isn't it? They have to be taught again because they were here and they came back down, and he says, you have come to need. So they came to a point where they actually needed someone to give them milk and not solid food. And the implication, of course, here also is that what he's talking about with Melchizedek is meat. It's not milk. There's a thinking process that has to go on here, and he's afraid they won't be able to get it, so he's trying to encourage them to think deeper. Look at the beginning in that verse. Though by this time you ought to be teachers, does that imply that every one of us should be teachers? In some capacity, yeah. We ought to have enough information that we could share it with someone else, right? That's what a teacher does. And it's not suggesting that everyone should be taking turns teaching class. That's not the point. But if we are not able to teach, then we are not, it's a sign that we're not going in the right direction. So how much does study have to do with our growth? A lot, right? Yeah, you have to have the knowledge. Wisdom comes from knowledge that we learn how to apply to life. But if you don't have the knowledge base, you can't apply it. And that's the real point here, is that we need to have a base that we can work with, that we can grow from. Growth is not memorizing the Bible. Growth is taking the information from the Bible and figuring out how to make it work in everyday life. That's what it's about. Yeah, Linda? Yes, right. Yeah. In fact, if you look at verse 14, solid food belongs to those who are full age, mature. That is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil, right? So how do we exercise how do we discern between good and evil? What do we have to have in order to do that correctly? Knowledge, maturity. In fact, he says, have our senses exercised, is what mine says. Does any translation have anything different? It does relate to our conscience. Does yours say power of discernment? So where it says senses, mine says senses exercised, yours says powers of discernment. Interesting, okay. Trained to discern good and evil. All right, so that means that we have to be taught how to discern between good and evil, and God does that through His Word, right, and through teachers and preachers, that kind of thing. That's a really important idea, because we're running into people all the time who believe they can tell right from wrong, and they may not be able to. They can on big things. I mean, everyone knows it's wrong to murder, but we have to work through these things, and we're thinking spiritually about all kinds of things, and we need help and guidance in doing that. Yeah, Paul? Yeah, that's right. And that's one of the reasons that it's really important that we are careful who we're listening to. I'm not saying that it's wrong to read or hear anyone else that's not a member of the church, but we got to be really careful with that, because the reason they think the way that they do is because they've learned how to reason through in accordance with to come up with this particular idea. And if that reasoning process is not instructed from God and God's word, then the whole thing is suspect, right? So we have to be very careful when we're listening to other people. I'm not saying, like I said, it's foolish of us to think that just because we're members of the church that we are thinking correctly. I mean, I've met plenty of Christians who don't think correctly, but we just have to be careful of that. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I'm not sure about that, right? Yeah, we need to listen to those little alarm bells going off if we hear them. I think some people don't actually may not actually have them. I'm not sure, but I know I do. And so, have you ever been someplace or talked to someone and you heard something and you're like, I can't put my finger on it, but that just doesn't feel like it's right. Well, that's a sign that maybe something here is not connecting with what was said, and there may be some conflict. And you delving into that might be just the thing for you to see, oh, here's the reasoning process. And this is the reasoning process that I have, and we will make sure that we have the right reasoning process. Yeah. Right. Hmm. Yeah, you get more and more out of it. Yeah, that does help quite a bit. It's more of a general idea, but it is effective, and so that's what you're doing. You're training your conscience, and this is what the Bible teaches. And so people, in reasoning, like you said, that we learn thought processes. I remember talking to a Russian. I was talking to one of them who he's had a doctorate and all kinds of stuff, and he was brilliant. And then I met another one who was just almost equally as brilliant and had no college degree. I said, "So how did you learn to think?" And he said, "Studying the Bible." So you study the Word of God, and this is how God thinks. He's expressed it through people, and yeah, it's a great way to it curbs your mind. It kind of softens the edges. Yeah, right. Yeah, we have to continue coming back to this and question. You know, we don't feel comfortable with people questioning our beliefs, and we start throwing up red flags. Somebody brings up a question, and if we do is sit around and question, yeah, I question whether or not we should do that. But if we don't ask questions about what we believe to figure out why we think the way we do, then we're doing ourselves a disservice, because we're not growing and maturing. Just because my parents taught me doesn't mean that they were right. And we tell everyone else that too, but we often do the same thing. Well, I had my favorite preacher said this. It can't be wrong. Yes, it can. That's right. That's true. It can. If it's an honest interrogation, yeah. But that's the rub, because I've run into people who said I've seen elders who they say we're going to restudy this and instrumental music or whatever. And after 2 years of intense, deep study, they come up with a conclusion that, oh, we've been wrong all this time. Like, what intense, deep study led you to that conclusion? It wasn't study. What you're doing is studying what people said about the Bible instead of studying the Bible, because there's no way you can come up with any other idea. Somebody else's hand was there. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's true. And those things kind of tended to go the wrong way. Now, I'll tell you what, though, if you read a debate, it's a lot easier than watching or listening to one. So I want to encourage you to read debates, because you're going to see all kinds of perspectives you never dreamed were out there, and you'll be able to either put holes in it or actually learn something, which is phenomenal, right? If you can actually learn something from somebody, that's wonderful. But we have to be careful, because we don't want to automatically go into any kind of a discussion or study thinking, well, I've got the answer. I just need to find out how the Bible supports that. That's the wrong way to approach it. You come at it and say, okay, what does this really mean? And dig in. And like Joe said, truth can stand up to scrutiny. And you know what? If you give it intense scrutiny and you find out that it wasn't true, that's exactly what you want to happen, right? You don't want to keep believing something that's false. So we need to dig in. Okay, so how do we determine whether we are where we should be in knowledge? Yeah. Mm-hmm. It certainly helps. Yeah, it helps. And when we were in preaching school, there were guys that could do that. They would have competitions, and they would throw out a verse, and then they had to quote the verse before and after it, and they would do that for hours. And I'm like, how do you have so much memorized? And so I tried my best. I mean, I memorized several books, and you know what? It taught me some things, but I also learned that just because I have it in here doesn't mean it's in here. Just because I have it in here doesn't mean I'm actually living it. And I'm not saying I'm not saying it's bad. It's actually really good for memory work. It's good for you, because it helps you learn how to think, and it helps you to remember details you never would have noticed before. But we got to get things in the right order. In fact, Khrushchev supposedly had the entire New Testament memorized. How much good did it do him? Yeah. Yeah. They spend all their time learning how to quote it. Yeah. All right. That's true. Yeah, Robert. Yeah. Yeah, and in answering the question, I think all of y'all were. I'm not saying you weren't, but I don't think we're ever going to get it to a point where we can say, I'm done. That's not the question, right? The question is, when do we know that we're mature? Part of that is, well, can we teach it to other people? And I tell you what, if we can teach very specific things and miss the bigger pictures, we don't really understand it yet. And so we need to be careful. But because he says at this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you the milk. And we could go into a lot of discussion and debate about what the milk is. I once asked a question. It was an email group that I was in. I was first preaching, and I asked an innocent question of these preachers. I said, can somebody tell me what you need to know in order to become a Christian? And I got hate mail. This one guy emailed me back immediately, said, were you trying to get me, kind of trap me or something? And he didn't appreciate the fact that I was trying to cause trouble. I'm like, I just want to know what you think, right? And then I learned that those are difficult things. Can anyone give me a list of everything that we would consider milk? I don't know I can't make that list. I know some things that are on it, but some of the things I think are milk may not be milk at all. May be more difficult, and vice versa. So, well, we almost made it through the chapter. Yeah. Yeah. We need a good foundation of understanding. Yeah. Yeah. No, I wasn't. In fact, I specifically said I wasn't trying to discourage that because it's good for us. Yeah. You got to start somewhere. You got to put it in your head. Yeah, that's right. And the better you know it, the better off you're going to be. Sure. So. Yeah. 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 You have to learn how to ask the right questions, right? Yeah. What does that mean? Yeah. That's the only way to get it. That it'll stay. Yep. All right. Thank you very much.